All you need is a girl and a gun. No, fuck it, let's do it again.
I knew you were going to start with that quote.
Yeah, of course you did.
I would have done too.
This is MoobTube, a Jean-Luc Godard special. Part 1. The New Wave.
All you need is a girl and a gun. Those are the notorious words of France's most long-lived and controversial filmmaker, Jean-Luc Godard. From Cahier to Cannes, JLG has defined Gallic cool and then reinvented it over and over. Here is a cinema of deconstruction, but very, very literally. His svelte, seductive rebels without causes of the 1960s have given way over the decades to Maoist agitprop, mythic lovers, and essays of obliteration. He's the filmmaker your boyfriend professes to love. It's why he pretends to smoke gitanes. But there's no way to compress JLG into a single episode. So instead, we're embarking on a 3-part series, and this is the first. A starry-eyed yet cool look at Godard's first decade in film. From a bout to souffle to Weekend, from black and white to colour, from sex to semiotics, his marriage to Anna Karina and his divorce, his satirical puppeteering of genre film becoming a kind of vivacious voodoo. Get your sage and your soul ready. Joining me on this bumpy yet dazzling ride is as ever Ralph Pritchard. Ralph, ça va?
Ouais, ça va bien, merci. It was a real pleasure this week getting really immersed in Godard. He is, of course, he launched on the stage as a French New Wave innovator in 1960 with Breathless. And there was a kind of colleague rivalry between him and Francois Truffaut, who made 400 Blows a year earlier. And I was always more of a 400 Blows fan. When I first saw Breathless, I didn't quite get it. And I think I saw it for the third time last week in preparation for this show. And it's still not my favourite Godard, but it kind of captures for me how he kind of oscillates between quite immediate girl and gun sort of films like Breathless and A Band Apart.
The genre
yeah,
kick.
that are very much kind of rooted in the immediacy of genre and kind of have a trash element. That's the element of Godard that Tarantino was so inspired by, and he called his film production company Band Apart. And then there's also the more constructed, more Bressonian, more sort of pop art version of Godard. But both styles, and I'm just talking about the 60s here really, both styles just have this incredible devotion to cinema. And that's something I guess I didn't realize about the New Wave guys when I first started getting into Godard. Like there are the Romer and Chabrol and Rivette, were part of that crew, but I think there's idea about jump cuts and about styles and stuff, but basically it's this.
Godard was the high priest of this.
Basically, it's about this love of cinema and using genre, and this kind of ambivalent worship of America, where you take bits of that, but then you chop it up and cut it up and bring this new kind of modernist European energy to it. That's what I got from it this time around, amongst many other things that we'll touch on.
Many other things. I mean, really, we're looking at 7 years between Breathless and Weekend. A prodigious and very prolific period in his life. Because obviously the interesting thing was he went from critic to filmmaker. Yeah. His first film was 54, 55, which was a documentary about a concrete factory. And he studied cinema first. And he criticised cinema, and his, if you read the book Godard and Godard, you can get a good taste of his reasonably iconoclastic style of his quite phenomenal, as it were, bodied style of film criticism. And you can kind of get a sense, and he kind of reviewed everything, and he did a lot of interviews as well. And one thing that him and the group around who formed around Cahier, were consciously striving against a form of cinema which they felt was kind of ideologically, generically, formally boring in a way, because they came of age at a time when France was entangled in colonial engagements and disengagements. So in Indochina, in Algeria, the kind of shit that informed heavily like contemporary writers and politicians and bubbled up in the 1960s into not necessarily a direct. This isn't like the Battle of Algiers. Sorry, it's not a direct confrontation with those politics. It's the idea of the frontier always returns home, and this is the 60s, and for the new wave and for Godard, it's the frontier rolling back, and how that kind of how these youngish and young filmmakers kind of interpreted modernity in a quite traditional, staid, puffy, pompous France with very simple cinema that was very easy. They were young Turks, right? It's probably the right way to. As a group, they probably. Because when we talk about the new wave in other contexts and other countries, they don't seem as coherent and as ideologically driven as the French new wave. When you look at the kind of the modernism of Italian cinema, it's all much more kind of appropriate, I suppose, kind of anomic and disparate.
Yeah, it's more individualized, I suppose, to particular directors.
Whereas this was a very collective.
Yeah, they were all writing
right?
scenarios for each other and stuff.
Yeah.
And working with Ralph Godard, the cinematographer, he worked.
Ralph Godard, Legrand, frequently
Michel Legrand,
doing the music and composition and scoring for Godard and others. I mean, there's a few ways we can approach this. I think we can kind of talk about the films we've chosen, because obviously when we say we've chosen films in the 60s, we've had to exclude certain ones, so we've been a bit. Because there's so many, not out of any censorious
spirit. Just that, like we wanted to focus on just a handful. So we kind of watched Breathless, Vivre, Bande à part, Alphaville, Pierrot le Fou, Weekend, and then I also just re-upped on Le Mépris, but yeah.
Big man. I was watching La Chinoise, but I agree, La Chinoise is quite weak. It's his most kind of dogmatic.
But that's something we can talk about, right? His move, because you said earlier that his work is kind of displays the effects of a political conflict, but doesn't bring those conclusions, bring those contradictions to their conclusion in a way that he absolutely does later on in his career. But to an extent, we'll cover that when we do the Gigaverto films.
Yeah. So I mean, let's talk about the kind of film that. Godard is with Breathless and Sous Ma Vie, and Band of Outsiders. It's a period of like 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, I assume our audience obviously have watched all of these films.
I think most people who are into film have kind of at some point in their life sort of gone through like a handful of these. I know I did. Phase. Like at some of these films I was seeing for the first time, like Pierrot le Fou and Bande à part.
What was your first Godard?
Breathless. And it kind of put me off Godard. Not like really put me off, but I just didn't see what was exciting about him. And it wasn't.
It can make it feel minor.
Yeah, it just sort of felt a bit scrappy, and I think also it's one of those films that influenced so much and allowed so much that it's often quite hard to see what those innovations are. We were talking about this a little bit in relationship to Brakhage last week with Daniel. Like it's opening the door with what it's doing. But actually, lots of people then went on to use that, be influenced by that, and do more interesting things. Godard himself, I would say, opened the door for himself with Breathless to make Vivre in 1962, which is, I think, maybe my favourite Godard film. I was really stunned by it this time around.
That's really interesting.
It's like very minimalist. It's told in these Brechtian 12 chapters. It's the story of a woman played by Anna Carino who becomes a prostitute, and it's just the story of her beginning turning those tricks and meeting people, and it's got like certain elements of a sort of thriller, of a crime thriller. It's got certain quite just bits of joyous, like sad love of cinema. This clip of Joan of Arc, she's watching the cinema and she cries, and she's kind of mirroring Joan, the Falconetti Dreyer version. It's very open. It's kind of like this. To me, I think a lot of Godard films form like these. They're like fusions of different kinds of filmmaking. Because I think it's fair to say that because he is such a cineast. And with Vivre sa vie, it very much felt like the philosophical and romantic musing of Roma, which you see in all these cafe scenes where they're just like talking about Poe and all these different ideas, and then the minimalism of Bresson. I mean, there's so, especially when she's doing the sex work, there's just so many shots of shoulders or shots of people turning, or strange, quite unerotic, transactional, clinical depictions of the body, and
often quite strangely framed bodies. I mean, that's one of the key things with him. His camera was a very lingering thing. In one area where you begin to see it in Breathless, and he slowly refines this cinematography of and this editing style, which is formed of like jump cuts, discontinuous elements, intrusive elements that are non-linear. And obviously, if the cinema of the fathers that he was kind of pushing back against in the cinema of contemporary American cinema making was, narratively linear. It had the eye line vision, which was an important thing that he kind of criticized in Cahier before he did it in his own films, which is the idea that we talked about with Brackage, which is like character looks off screen, we see the object then that they're looking at, and then we might see the character's reaction or them moving towards it, and it kind of establishes this almost comic book style. And it's the idea, it's this confusing of the idea of cinema as a kind of narration, and for Godard he was inverting that, and it's why you will get, I mean, for example, the way that Sur ma vie begins with
Vivre sa vie.
Vivre sa vie, sorry, not Sur ma vie, Vivre sa vie, big Ackerman, Jesus.
It's good representation for women filmmakers.
Yeah, it is. And the accidental inclusion of women in this film, but it begins with like framed shots of people's back, and you hear voices, you hear them talking, but you don't see the male to her right, for example. You just see the back of her head, and you don't see her face for quite a while.
You see slivers of their faces as they turn to each other, but they're not really turning to each other very much because of the kind of coldness of the interaction.
Revealed. Yeah, and it automatically establishes this anomie and abjection which runs through his films, because like one thing you alluded to, with both these first two films is that, and Breathless, is that he's kind of obsessed with rebels, outsiders, outcasts, people living not necessarily on the edge of society, because they're typically he does include kind of working class people, but they're Parisian, they're not the salt of the earth. They might work in a factory or something, but they're literally they have like leisure time and money to burn occasionally, sometimes literally. And it's, where am I going with that? It is a way of establishing these quite disconnected people. Modern life is not fulfilling them. There is a sense of dissonance and anomie, which is kind of, well, we call it ennui, wouldn't we, in France, right? It's kind of hovering around and through them, and these people are quite cold towards one another. I mean, so yeah, we've kind of skirted over Breathless. It was a story from I think he really liked from a newspaper. It was like the big story of that summer.
Oh, right, the guy that's on the run.
Yeah, on the run. He goes on the run with his girlfriend, and she kind of dobs him in, and he dies in a shootout, which is basically what Breathless is about. But it's also about so much more than that. I mean, what else struck you about these first two films?
I guess there's a kind of, as I say, an oscillation between chaos and control, which I was having just watched Mépris, which I know you've seen. That is like so controlled. I mean, it's about cinema, it's about filmmaking, it's about a film being made and the kind of antics behind that. But it's not at all like a making of. I mean, the shots about the people making the films are extremely. It's all in CinemaScope. It's very controlled.
Yeah.
The dialogue is very much like a Hollywood movie. Some of it's in English because there's an American character. But yeah, I mean, I guess the angle I want to bring in, because it's a thread that runs through all these films, is like Godard's own relationship issues. I don't want to be like be sort of facile or gossipy, but like, he meets he meets Anna Karina while he's auditioning for Breathless. She stars in Vivre sa vie. It's not her first role, but she stars in Vivre sa vie in this kind of it's not without symbolism that it's a film about someone kind of starting as a prostitute, and it's also the director's. There's some kind of analogy with acting there, and that's happening, and kind of there's something about the way she is on screen. I mean, there's a lot of sort of stories about how they were when they worked together, and I think Karina like attempted suicide several times while she was making that film. It was quite high octane and intense as a role, I imagine.
Explosive
and
relationship.
Just the relationship, yeah. Bande à part, she's this incredibly ambivalent. Well, Le Mépris, 1963. She's not in that film, but Brigitte Bardot wears a wig that's extremely similar to the hair she has in Vivre, and
she's almost playing
absolutely, because she's playing the girl, sort of very attractive girlfriend of a screenwriter, playwright, essentially like a stand-in for Godard, and it's about him kind of trying to choose between his fidelity. It's a film about a film, and it's a film, and both films are about fidelity. And there's this kind of overarching metaphor of like loyalty to the work of filmmaking versus loyalty to one's loved ones. Yeah,
considering we can take from the Mépris that he, in a sense, kind of chooses his creative path over almost the woman and the American movie producer.
Yeah,
they die in a car accident, famously. Yeah, spoiler alert, but yeah, it's a pretty on the nose
shot
way.
I noticed you can see. I'm always interested when this happens and whether or not it's deliberate. I think it's very deliberate in that final shot. On the rear of the car, the camera tracking and the boom and all the crew are reflected.
Yeah. And you see at the beginning as well, you see those tracking shots where you've got Fritz Lang stalling to shoot his movie about the Odyssey, and you see these tracking shots at the beginning of this, the camera rolling up the rails, shooting statues, and then we see them in the screening room. I mean, one of the interesting things about Godard is that he is, normally when people do a film within a film, it's a metafictional thing that's often purely psychological. With Godard, I think he was trying to resolve and rationalize, and I think it becomes more clear during the 60s, and as you move into 67 and Chinois, and you move into his association with the Ziegler Vertov group, he's trying to problematize and resolve what the role of the filmmaker is. And I think Mépris, it's funny because like Mépris feels like it's not that early, it's not that late in his career, it's very early in his career, and it feels like a later career film. It's he like made the mature magnum opus, because for a lot of directors that's as good as they get. As good as they get is Le Mépris, and that's kind of the eighth film they make, or the seventh film they make.
But it's also quite a basic film in a lot of ways. Like it's quite.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking compositionally. He is mastered by Le Mépris all the tools of making a beautiful melodrama.
It's a very melodramatic. I mean, again, like good's good. It's like Cirque or something. Like he's pressing certain buttons really well in a really classical way. I guess. Just to continue my romance thought, we moved through to Bande à part in 1964, which has this Jules Legime style, or also a bit like later on Love is Colder Than Death, starring Fassbinder, this criminal love triangle that shows Anna Karina sort of kind of, again, this like really fierce kind of closed off ambivalence. And then, Alphaville is really obviously, one of the critics referred to it as wife imitates art. It's made at the time that the divorce, there was a divorce between Anna and Jean-Luc, and at the very end, she's sort of playing like an almost android-like seductress in this dystopian world where all feeling has been banned.
A literal the word love, I love you.
Yeah, exactly. People are being executed for crying when members of their family die. And so at the end of the film, spoiler alert, she's in a car with this guy and who she's been hired to sort of seduce and extort. And she sort of learns to feel and say the words "I love you" to him, which is this huge wish fulfillment of the director who's kind of trying to cling on to this relationship that's falling apart. 100%.
Because he in typically in other films the rebels have jumped in, because the automobile is he's almost like a Balladian figure in a way. The automobile is hugely important, but he takes the automobile to bigger lengths than the erotics of Ballard. And he's, during the 60s, particularly, Godard is obsessed with cars and motor vehicles. I think purely sometimes just because of the romance associated with a beautiful car. and the freedom it enables. A lot of his characters jump in a car, they steal a car, they crash a car, they steal another car, they drive it off into the sunset. Often they come to grief. Bands apart, the car which they drive frenetically and dangerously, they pretty much all get fucked up by the end. And obviously in Mépris, a car accident at the end kills the producer and it kills Brigitte Bardot. But in Alphaville, the car is the escape vehicle. They go to the outer countries, they leave. It's a happy ending, despite the fact that everyone in Paris or Alphaville is dead.
Yeah.
Pretty much by the end, I think she says, "Are they all dead?" He says, Lemmy Caution says, "Not yet." No.
That's reassuring.
He literally kills everyone. Yeah, he ends this technocratic dictatorship of Alphaville, run by Alpha 60, this belching computer.
I'm not going to do the voice actually.
By killing literally everyone.
It's a guy whose vocal cords were shot off during the war, and he'd relearned how to speak.
I was wondering that.
Extraordinary.
Holy shit! Because I thought it was like one of those vocalizers that people who have throat cancer get. Like the guy in South Park. Yes, I talk.
Oh right, no. It's
you have like the vibrator.
It's not really electronic. Yeah. It's just a guy who he relearned how to speak after losing his vocal cords. Just so speaking purely from his diaphragm.
It's funny because because it's weird because there's an English version of the film. The one that was done for English distribution had the voice was dubbed again in French. With a more computerized sounding voice. I don't think people found it really unpleasant.
It is really unpleasant. I almost want to see that version, but then also I think I've learned to accept that voice.
It was less great.
Yeah, it really pissed me off the first time I saw that film.
First time it's very dumb, but I think it is. You cannot escape the meandering logic of this Alpha 60, this computer, which is rather irrationally almost used reason and logic, the marketplace for ideas, to kind of dominate Alphaville, the society, which is Paris. And then one of the things that critics say about it is it's a science fiction film without any special effects. And one of the most incredible sleight of hands of Godard and Alphaville is that he creates a dystopia just by using modern day Paris. It's shot entirely at night. It uses buildings like the Electricity Board building, which was a new and quite controversial building in Paris because it was considered to be extremely ugly. The what is known as the Wall, I think it's like the 18th arrondissement, which is this huge, along the Seine, it's this huge endless block of flats and apartments, again part of like French urban planning after the war. My cat is taking a shit, sorry, it's kicking dust everywhere. But there was he's kind of engaging with that Paris, the reconstruction of Paris after the war, is the kind of a victory of ugliness. Because one thing that Godard is really, you see it in all of these films, he lingers on traditional art actually, and so for somebody who's such a deconstructivist and such a radical, the use of classical music, the depiction of classic paintings,
a lot of people flicking through books, very Tarkovskian actually.
Very Tarkovskian. The tracking shot in Solaris over the Bruegel painting. There's lots of that. We see lots of classic art. And I think he's using it often just to elevate and to add melodrama to scenes. I don't think it's more complicated than that. Eventually, he uses advertising with Pierrot le Fou.
So to speak about Pierrot le Fou, like that for me feels like a kind of nostalgic remake of Breathless in a way. I feel like it is. It's obviously got Belmondo. It's got that criminality. It's got that fresh romance, but it is it is like I kind of think what he would have made maybe if he's had more money when he made Breathless. It is, but it is like,
it's interesting you say that. I agree.
It's got this kind of more, it's more playful, it's perhaps more twee. I know you hate the comparison because he wasn't a fan of Daisies by Vera Chetilova, neither am I, to be honest, but it does have like it's like kind of Daisies versus Bonnie and Clyde. It's got a very but also I love the Vietnam War scene where like she's yellowing up, I guess. I don't know, it's just it's kind of mad, but like I kind of love the theatrics of it. It's sort of just
it's one of the first time he really plays with theatre,
and
he
politics,
does it a lot in Weekend
politics,
politics, and he sees politics as a stage, and we will talk a lot about politics this episode and especially next. But you're right, it has the character who's running away. This time it's the girl who's the rebel. He kind of leaves. He's the character in that Pierrot. He's kind of dissatisfied with his humdrum bourgeois life, with his boring wife. And he goes to a party, and this is where he meets Anna Karina, who plays Marianne. Marianne Renoir, interestingly, and he plays Ferdinand Griffon.
I mean, the references. He plays Ferdinand, but she calls him Pierrot. I mean, Pierrot, I guess that's a reference to the clown.
A clown.
The references in Godard's work, like anything you think might be a reference is definitely a reference. Like even like in Alphaville when he's going 100%. To the basement and it's sous-sol SS and you think of the SS guards. It's just everything is a reference. It's kind of overwhelming sometimes.
It's the ultimate kind of a desert of signs almost, and it's important for him because he's I think so. People over intellectualize his critique of French society. I think his critique of French normalcy is like bourgeois culture is pretty straightforward. Like he finds it stultifying and creatively indifferent, quite an unpleasant, bland way to live. So his characters, even if they come to grief, it's the Bonnie and Clyde thing. They have they collapse beautifully, they burn beautifully, don't they? And it's one, Ferdinand Pierrot escapes. He runs away with Marianne, literally running away from this boring Parisian life. He goes to there's a kind of quite brilliant party that he goes to with his wife, and people are talking in advertising copy. They're not relating directly in meaningful conversations. Not that anyone really does in Godard.
That's a perfect kind of device. Talking, isn't it?
It's a really good device, and in other hands it would seem kind of stupid, but it just kind of works well because just the way he frames it. He frames it like an advert. He frames it like a dark room at one point. It's all bathed in red, they're in like the advertising studio. It's great. And that's the world he runs from, and then has this like Robinson Crusoe existence on the beach with a parrot and a monkey, I think. A monkey. And it's great. And he does begin to talk about the rebels are gun runners. So it is kind of alluding to people who were like supporting Algerian rebels and stuff like that. So he's being a bit more politically, more of an activist filmmaker in Pierrot le Fou.
It's so weird that I suppose 1968 is just around the corner, but it's so weird that he leans more towards that. I suppose I'm just projecting my own artistic development, but like going from romance and genre to politics, it's just that's like kind of the opposite direction to how I would imagine someone would move. But it's kind of,
you feel it would go from politics
because I think the idea that you can change the world through art in that sort of direct, didactic way seems naive to me. It seems like something you would disavow. You would what's the words? You'd mature from rather than something you'd mature into. But then again, we're talking about a very different era to the one we're currently in, and I guess maybe didactic political work. Obviously, it was being made a lot in the Soviet Union, but it wasn't. There weren't those forms in Western France.
No, and I think as well, even if. But he's
perhaps, not. I don't know.
He's not perhaps he's not wholeheartedly on board with any of the projects he depicts. He's not a kind of easy. I think he's a fellow traveller of ideology and the student movement and things like that. He satirizes those movements and their language as much as he does bourgeois language movements.
But he doesn't do it with quite the same abandon as Fassbinder, for instance. If you watch like The Third Generation by Fassbinder, which is a really bitingly cynical satire on like left-wing terrorist activism, like he's just saying these people are fucking idiots. It would be, but he also makes satires about the bourgeoisie. It would be like making a film about how stupid and self-regarding middle-class Corbyn activists are, and then making like a kind of grotesque, sort of bitter tears of Petra von Kant about aristocrats or royals or something. It's kind of like that. I mean, I'm diverting to Fassbinder now, but like there with Godard, there's a much clearer like the workers and the proletariat are opposed to each other. Like that is there. He's that's undergirding like most of what he does. Even I think the really early stuff, it's kind of present. But it is it's always mischievous because otherwise it would be so boring.
It would be so boring. I mean, it's interesting because part of the intellectual climate, because again, he was a critic, so it's fair to say that he's reading shit. He's not just making films. And you've got that Deleuze quote, right, which is that creating new circuits in art means creating them in the brain too.
Right.
And I think one thing that Godard is not doing, you've got that. Okay, yeah, he goes from a doomed romances and the genre of romances to politics, which, like you said, is an inversion of the norm, which I agree. But I think he wasn't trying to make politically active films. He was trying to make political art or make activism art. He was trying to synthesize what can sometimes be quite a schizophrenic split, between an artistic enunciation and actual political engagement. And he, it's can you there's that quite long, quite arduous essay in Efflux, which is quite good on this. We always say this, but we'll link it in the bio.
We never do.
They try and resolve the way that
we never have linked anything in the bio.
You just have to take our word for it.
Just look it up.
Look it up. But trying to resolve the contradictions between the idea of the filmmaker and the militant. I think, he was recreating cinema from the inside out. That other phrase he said, he was trying to travel to the inside of the image. He wasn't trying to change the stories of film. He was trying to change film, which is, all these little formal developments he was talking about. The eye line cut, like the non-linear editing.
I was thinking about this.
The disharmonious,
like the energy of the editing, which is kind of what the French New Wave is like most well known for. But it deserves like a bit of consideration for us as artists. Like I was hanging out with friend of the pod Daniel and our friend Lennart in the park on Monday when it was really nice. And Daniel had, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, he had a camera with him.
A huge erection. Wow.
For some reason he chose to show it to us. I mean, I don't judge, but he had a camera, like a DSLR that he'd recently purchased, and he was playing around with it and just filming our faces while we were talking, and like just filming this dog that came by and ate some food. And he did it in he then edited it just the same day or the following day and uploaded it as a private video on YouTube and sent it to us. And it was like this 1 minute film called A Day in Southwark Park, and it was quite brackish, it was silent, it had these kind of amazing kind of flickers between different faces. And it was like, I just thought like, wow, like that's so great. Like that's the sort of thing, like, I mean, I remember like when I was a teenager, I used to just always, I mean this in a very good way when I say I did this as a teenager, like, it's that amazing spirit of having discovered tools that you can do stuff with, and just whatever it is that you're doing at that moment, even if it's just hanging out with some friends and having some tins in the park.
Yeah, you can create something quite...
And I feel like, like I'm sort of now honing in on my target with this point. Like my flatmate was showing me this film by D.A. Pennebaker about a particular subway line. Some beautiful shots of subway. It's called Daybreak something or other. Anyway, great film, a 5-minute short film about the trains in New York. And I thought about Dziga Vertov, and I thought about like Dziga Vertov, like Man with a Movie Camera, has the energy of like having like discovered trains, or like having like and I think, I mean, I'm constantly amazed by...
He was autistic. He was spectrum.
Well, speaking as a fellow train lover and possibly autist, who knows? I was very, I'm very excited, but like I think trains are like the ultimate cinema metaphor.
They are fucking.
But like,
well, Lumiere,
exactly, first film. But yeah, the invention of machinery and transport are kind of discovered by Vertov in a way that is, I think, akin to the way that Godard discovers the fact that you can stop and start music and sound and cut sound out
halfway through
and cut scenes. Like it feels like he's just discovered that you can do loads of things, and he's not, for some reason, he's not precious. He's not thinking in a kind of Hollywood way, even with Le Mépris, although Le Mépris does have this really precious, pristine energy. But in all of his films, he's just like allowing for things to like stop and start. Like the music in Le Mépris and Vivre is like incredibly emotive and like saccharine sometimes, but then it just stops. It just starts and it stops, and it's like a kind of like a strange, dreamy, broken record situation. And I just wanted to say like that sense of discovery runs, I would say, having seen his most recent film, The Image Book, which we'll talk about with Daniel in a few weeks, like that runs through all of his work. And I think to reach age 90 and carrying that energy, that's why we're doing this podcast, because I think that's very rare.
Yeah, I think it is. And it's something that is always so... Yeah, you're right. It's the stuff you see maybe when you're juvenile and you forget about. and you become quite jaded to, you know, why Chris Marker is so exciting. You know, when I was like really young, watching like La Jetée, a film comprised entirely of discontinuous fragments, and the fragments always been really important to me artistically. Submerged, hidden, broken fragments to compose a whole. Like I was just working recently on a kind of experimental sound documentary about unfinished Eisenstein film, Bez and Meadow. I talked about a couple of weeks ago, but that I kind of was like getting to grips again with just like really discontinuous, weird editing, where you pull stuff together in quite at first kind of irregular ways, and the mature mind says, no, I need to smooth these things and kind of make them join hands. But it's quite exciting that you don't have to, and you can leave things unresolved and ugly. Like you let the ugliness enter the film a bit. And again, it's what he does so well. You know, Weekend is such a great example of that, because you're right. You know, you'll have some really Legrand's intense orchestral melodramatic music, and it will just stop halfway through a scene. Or another scene will have no music, no sound, and it will just be there'll be no diegetic sound or non-diegetic sound. There'll be nothing, and then halfway through you'll hear a phone call, or something will ring, or a door will slam, and then a couple of frames later you'll see, more than a couple of frames later, you'll see like the door open or something. And it's this harmony is such a good way of him disarraying the pieces of film, and it makes it exciting to watch. It's why Weekend is so fun to watch. And it's even like it's in Alphaville, it's done more with chaotic acting almost. It's Lemmy Caution, like this big brute who's rolling through these buildings, and you know, he'll open a door and just yank somebody out and shoot him in the head. You know, and it's great, and it's lots of collapsing and falling, and it's he does it with editing, he does it with the actors he works with in the stories that he kind of builds and the worlds he creates. But let's talk about Weekend, because I think Weekend is an important tipping point for Godard, because he's got these films under his belt, and then in 1967 he releases two films. We won't talk about Chinois, but a much more politically dogmatic film, but we will talk about Weekend, which is, I think they're both circling the same planet.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, to continue my gauche mashup approach to analysing these films, I would describe Weekend as a kind of cocktail of Jacques Tati, Michael Haneke, and Children of Men. You know, it's got this strange, quite uniquely French slapstick humour, this absurdity, the literally the use of traffic, which is a kind of Tati trope. Funny use of sounds as well to kind of just signal absurdity, but it also has this real doomy apocalyptic vibe and this real heavy critique. It's a bit like Time of the Wolf by Haneke, which we reviewed many months ago. It's like this real critique of bourgeois indulgence, and the plot line is so crucial here. Like, the plot line is a couple who are plotting to kill the woman's father, or someone's father, and they are also plotting to kill each other and run off with the money of the father with their own mistresses. And what's the man version of a mistress? Affair.
They're not allowed them, so I don't know. Bull. Her the cuck, the uncuck.
Yeah, the
whatever.
Bull is the opposite of a cuck. Bull is the guy who's wandering in with his.
So much better to be the bull. I don't know, actually. We don't judge.
We don't judge on this podcast. This is a safe space for cucking and bullying and everything in between.
All sorts of perversion. You're right. It is the actual plot. The story itself is insane. It's extremely turbulent. It's not necessarily obvious what the plot is. There is like the road trip, right? It's all centered around this road trip, and they have to drive to a village or another town, which it could be the other end of France, or it could be like a half an hour drive away. I think it's quite close. And it's what befalls them, and what befalls them on this journey is the collapse of civilization, the removal of restraint, and the descent of French society into absolute chaos. But key here, you talked about bourgeois kind of, I think, indulgence. I think that's true. It was also like the indifference to violence that had kind of leaked into modern society. Like one of the things that happens in brutal, horrible things happen in this film. nobody pays it any heed.
Yeah.
People do horrible things and don't. There's no regret here. There's no.
And everyone is out to get each other, and everyone is an archetype as well. It's almost like none of the violence really matters because everyone is just symbolic of their class position. You have the revolutionaries who are basically 100%. Cannibals who just they think there's no way past the colonial inequalities without just eating the people who were in charge before. And then you have the bourgeois who are all trying to kill each other to try and get to the top. The most kind of the bit that's like most accessible is this very sexy but quite brutal analysis scene where the woman's, I think she's talking to her shrink. They're sort of in shadow, so it's quite.
No, it's her husband.
Oh, that's her husband.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm stupid.
Yeah, it's her husband.
So she's talking to her husband.
No, you're not.
But it looks a bit like the therapy scene because they're not really looking at each other, and she's just.
Apart from she's in her
she's
bra.
Describing, well, I mean, that could happen in a French therapy scene, I'm sure.
That could happen.
But she's chatting about this orgy where at the point of orgasm she's got an egg kind of stuffed between her buttocks, which cracks and spills the yolk all down her, which is like, it's extraordinarily erotic, and it's kind of like the closest they get to tenderness is this like very pornographic description. It's a bit like that scene in Persona, which it probably was influenced by, where the woman describes the orgy to the silent actress. But yeah, so I'm slightly flagging. I had the vaccine this morning, and I'm starting to get a bit ill. So
I can. It's okay. This is you're seeing in real time.
Yeah, I'm just trying to sort of get through all my points so that I don't kind of miss them out.
AstraZeneca or no. I think what you're right there. There's
sure, man. Believe in Britain.
AstraZeneca, believe in Britain are vaccines. So there is this incredibly tender and quite erotic cucking admission almost, which is the moment of therapy, and it's in the dark, like you said, and the way she relates it is exceptional because she's not obviously titillated or charged. She's kind of pacing the room. They occasionally stop to talk about cigarettes, and she's like, then he spread my legs, and then I'll say, well, what did he do then?
What do you think he did?
Pulled out his and it's like, he got out and he waved his manhood around, he waved his cock around. It's like, okay, what then? And then he asked us to kiss, and it's this kind of blow by blow, literally narration of what happened during this orgy. An incredibly tender moment, which is kind of a lot like it's got similarities to the Brigitte Bardot nudity scene.
Oh yeah, do you love my thighs? Do you love my shoulders? Do you love my eyes?
Which I believe I believe that was asked to be included by the studio executives.
Oh really?
So it wasn't originally planned. I think that was actually asked for.
It's great, but you do forget about it by the end of the film because the color changes at various points, and it's sort of even though it's about the two main characters, it's not a film set. It's filmed as though it's like a fake scene within the film, but it is just them in bed. They're not actors. I mean, they're
having quite a tender.
But yeah, it's quite
in that moment. They're not
quite interesting that it was requested by the studio.
Yeah, I think I could be wrong about that, but I am too bullish to look it up and fact check myself.
Interesting.
So, bullish.
Showing your cards.
Showing my cards, mate. But it is true that the rest of the film is. I'll just quickly scout over it. The rest of the film is dominated by, like you said, people who are symbolic of their class positions. Great violence without regret. People do horrible things to each other. Nobody shows remorse or any emotion when they're doing it. And there are moments of class solidarity. Some people will, at one point they are kidnapped in their own car by this almost clown-like figure who holds them at gunpoint, and then they kind of the battle turns and they chase him away, and he's this kind of bohemian prophet kind of figure. Another moment they get almost run over loads of times. They eventually there's running gun battles. There's a lot of violence that kind of is bubbling over, but it's always symbolic. There's a character who's dressed like a French revolutionary reading from a book about tenderness and love, a man's duty to another man, or one person's duty to another person. And for that it's the hilarity and the satire is run through with moments of great beauty and great violence, like the burning of the shepherd girl. The husband kind of pushes her to the floor and literally just burns her to death. And no one puts her out. It's incredible.
But you do feel like, you do feel he's very much more in the dogmatic mode when he's showing those things. Like, why else would you show those things? It's not really true that everyone in that class position behaves with that brutality. It's more like trying to show something. Like, obviously on a structural level, like the bourgeoisie do oppress the proletariat with that level of violence, but it's never done so directly and with such kind of wanton cruelty and psychopathy. You know, it's like, okay, like everyone is now a serial killer. Like that's the analysis that we can, which is, you know.
But he's almost saying that your intentions are like whether you stab someone softly or brutally, you're still killing them. Your intentions are irrelevant because the violence is being done, and he's showing the violence that's there. He sees in French society. It's complicated because there's so much we can say about, you know, which we haven't mentioned, which is about language, about ideology. You know, one thing that Godard is, and we'll talk about it a lot more in parts 2 and 3, is he's interested in semiotics. He's interested in the relationship between language, images, ideology, and the world, and how these things, you know, language can be used to dominate and it disempower when it's not understood. You know, in Alphaville, the Bible, what Anna Karina calls the Bible, turns out to be a dictionary. And one thing that Alpha 60, the computer, can't understand is it understands individual words but cannot understand complex wholes. It can't understand sense. So when it kind of interrogates Lemmy Caution, he gives reasonably opaque answers to questions, but they're not. But the computer interprets them as opaque answers, and it can't pass his meaning. It treats them as illogical because it can't resolve the meaning, the poetic meaning. One key scene, he gives a book to Anna Karina. Is it City of Sadness or something? Like Dolor, like the City of Sadness. And she reads from it and she can't understand the book. She can say it, but she can't understand it. And I think Godard is trying to reconfigure language as visual language and literal language to short circuit people's brains, like I mentioned with Deleuze earlier, to recircuit people's brains, to kind of wrest control back from Hollywood, to wrest control back from the bourgeois, to wrest control back from political elites. It's all there. Like, it's all there.
Yeah, I mean, his relationship to Hollywood's really interesting. I don't think he ever made a Hollywood film, right? I mean, that's not that I would expect that of him, but that's something that certain directors, you know, like Francois Truffaut did, not a Hollywood film exactly, but he did Fahrenheit 451, which was in English, and much more mainstream.
Of course, yeah.
So, like, yeah, he sort of he's very influenced by Hollywood, but he uses it and cuts it up, and much like Fassbinder in his early years, plays with that genre, those tropes and those genres to his own advantage. And he has that kind of, I think Hollywood, because it's such cliche, has, I don't quite know why this is the case, but it definitely is the case. Like, Hollywood is such a cutout cliche. It's almost like if you were collaging, right? You know, like, it's easier to collage with really archetypal, familiar images from a magazine of like advertising images of women in bikinis, or, you know, the Mona Lisa or Renaissance stuff. It's like easier to collage with things that are familiar, because what you're doing to them is a form of like distancing, or like you're kind of breaking it apart. Like you're kind of, it would be harder perhaps to collage a collage, right? To kind of use Godard's work as a collage, because it's already, you know, it's not, although maybe something like Breathless, which is more in the lexicon, is more familiar. I think something about collage is like, it thrives off, definitely when I make collage works, it's the collaging is always strengthened by motif and use of the familiar and repetition, because that shows in clearer detail like what you're doing with the image. It's more self-reflexive. So in a way, Godard is, it's like, I don't know, like the only metaphor I can think of is like, you know, like oil being mined. Like, oil is the result of like generations, layers of like decomposed carbon, you know, and it's like he's kind of using this pre-existing sediment of culture and just like
deconstructing it and playing with it. Because I think one thing that obviously the Hollywood system was based on was the idea that that film is reducible to a series of mechanical generic techniques, genres and generic scenes and tropes, and that is what all film comes out of. And I think by using those tropes, Godard shows that they are, I guess the word we'd use now is like problematic, or he shows that these tools can be broken and the truth will be revealed by seeing them when you reassemble them. So he's literally, especially in these early films, Breathless and so on, he is literally and Bande apart, he's literally dismantling traditional genre films and satirizing them in a way, breaking them up, making them unrecognizable, or just recognizable enough.
It's a complete antithesis of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. He's like, I will use the master's tools on every occasion because they're kind of amazing in a new house.
And he still loves them. I think you mentioned Tarantino earlier. There is an ode to this. Like, he loves cinema. I think he loves the visual act, the storytelling. There's that article I sent you earlier, which is like just a photo gallery in a BFI of like Jean-Luc Godard on set. Like, he loves filming. This is a gurning man, like smiling, winking at the camera, playing. When you see an interview with him, he's got his trademark sunglasses on. He loved the language of looking.
Totally.
And if it was generic,
Jean-Luc
and
Godard.
if it was generic,
there is something in Band Apart. His name appears as Jean-Luc Cinema Godard, which is like amazingly arrogant.
I mean, that's another thing we didn't talk about. His use of intertitles, and he's probably that is a body of work. That
always sets the scene, right at the start, to have those very self-conscious. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Band Apart. Actually, I have a quote which is maybe good for the end.
Actually, I was thinking now.
Go for it. I'll save the quote till the end. But Band Apart, I didn't really write that much about Band Apart because I was quite perplexed by it. This is the first time me and Owen are using notes because there's so many films and we really want to get this right. I mean, the guy might die next week.
Professionals here.
Not Owen, Godard. But who knows?
Not me.
But
that's a speech act.
Godard. So like Band Apart is like, I didn't really like Band Apart. I found the characters kind of the male characters quite irksome. I just didn't really understand why Anna Karina's character was turned on by them. But then often you don't understand why women are interested in certain men. But it seems like, in contrast to Breathless, where the guy is a bit of a pig by today's standards, but he's so lovable and so kind of so charming. Whereas these guys were utterly graceless. But I guess what I wanted to ask you, and I don't know how many times you've seen Band Apart. This is my first time. Do we think it gets better on the second viewing? I didn't have time to view it a second time, but
I've only seen it once.
I reacted against it, but then when I sort of read more about it, I was like, actually, like, if you kind of accept what it is, which is this very sort of stop and start hodgepodge of like cinematic tropes and like Jules Legime and like just weird, awkward brutality. And self-reflexivity, like this scene where they're like, let's be silent for a minute, and then they're silent for like 30 seconds, but literally the sound of the film cuts out. It's such a sketching film, and it actually, for all that I didn't really enjoy it that much, I also did think like, to get a bunch of actors together and make something this off is kind of commendable.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it does. There's all the ingredients of his later films there, because it's, as opposed to Breathless, it's much more estranging and uncomfortable, a film to watch. And you can see him kind of mapping out what he's going to do later. I think because I'd seen it, I saw it like it was like the 5th out of 6. Godard films I'd seen literally consecutively night on night, and I think having seen these other films around it, maybe if I'd seen it on its own or had come to like Godard completely new, and maybe I wouldn't have vibed with it so much, but because I saw like the sperm floating around, that would later become fully like healthy bouncing babies, that's kind of what made it for me. And I think it's quite excellent in its own way because it has this kind of non-event, and that's one of the great things about the story is like unlike a Grand Rebellion, it's not like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or anything. It's not a Sergio Leone film. This is a rebels film where the rebels kind of don't really pull off their heist. It's all a bit of chaos. It kind of falls into physical comedy a lot, when they're sticking the ladder up the building.
It's like 40 Towers
to climb into the room. It's totally like 40 Towers, and they climb up the ladder and he just can't break the glass, which is absurd because it's like a single pane glass. He just can't break it, and then climbs down and they just get lost. And they lock the woman in the cupboard and she dies, but she's not dead. And the scene where there's the shootout, which is the kind of Western shootout, and the guy keeps shooting but missing.
Yeah.
It's great, and he's right in front of him, and it's incredible. And
it's like so
all those
it's
elements.
So wrong, it's right. I think like it's just there's so many off moments. Where just like,
I've got a soft spot for it. It's obviously got the famous dance scene.
Oh, the dance scene is beautiful. Yeah,
it's really beautiful because it talks about how they're feeling about each other. And she, while they were dancing, she wondered if were they thinking about the way her breasts were bouncing when they were dancing. It's got all these little self-aware moments where you see inside the character's mind.
Yeah, and there's a voiceover that's extremely invasive in a way, like
soothing.
Yeah, his voiceover just sort of.
Oh, okay, I find it quite soothing.
Sorry, it's not. I don't mean it's invasive as in like it takes you out of it. It does actually soothe you, but it's like it's not invasive to the viewer. It's just it gets inside. Really inside what's going on. It's kind of breaks the rule of like show don't tell. It's like this extra layer of tell that happens that actually does pretty much work in an odd idiosyncratic way. I don't think you do that for every film you do, but I think it's like a testament to his innovation that he did.
There's that really good I rarely do this, but there's a really useful article by Peter Woolen on Godard in his book about Godard, which is Godard Encounters Cinema, where he kind of picks out all the ways that he opposes his own cinema to the cinema of Hollywood, and he obviously has to strawman Hollywood a bit. And it often one of those, it's like transparent foregrounding as opposed to transparency is one of them, and he calls it language wants to be overlooked in the genre film, the Hollywood film, but in foregrounding he makes the mechanics of the film and text visible and explicit. So he's doing all these things. He's going against the grain. So it's still a genre film, but because it's going against the grain, that's where like that's where the light gets.
Well, he's disrupting the meaning.
That's the exciting thing.
I guess that's what he shares with René and Marker, is like that he uses voiceover. Like in Alphaville, he uses this voiceover. There's a shot of like so like this strange concert hall where the kind of the rake of seats just flips over, and on the voiceover you're being told that this is like an extermination device where people sit down and then they just get like turned upside down and crushed. Similarly, like there's the Alpha 60 robot is played by, in quotes, this whirring fan, this like industrial fan that's just and it just so and you've got these devices like the microphones. and the diving. I've got to shout out with Alphaville. I didn't really like Alphaville that much, but certain devices and pieces of action, it was just extraordinary, and I was bewitched by the sexy ladies who jump in and stab in the swimming. They jump into the swimming pool and stab this heretic. It's just someone who's kind of not played by these very emotionally repressive rules, and they're on a diving board and they get shot by a marksman, and then they get and then when they fall into the swimming pool, these bikini clad ladies
they finish them off,
jump in and finish them off with knives. It's just like so
it's remarkable. I think Alphaville is my favorite Godard film by far. For so many reasons, for a lot of that, for the its staging is
actually
incredible.
Totally makes sense. It's not my favorite.
It totally does.
It's actually not even close to my favorite, but I appreciate it.
No. Weekend has got to be the Godard film I enjoy the most. I really enjoy Weekend every time I've seen it. And I get something from it every time I watch it. It's such a delight because it's so erratic and so dysfunctional and so unexpected. And there's moments of great beauty. There's the scene where there's a pianist who is playing a concert to a farmyard, pretty much, and the camera pans twice around the entire farmyard, and it's a moment of peace, actually, in this world of chaos. Even though he kind of says he hasn't really got an audience, and he keeps saying I'm basically a shit pianist. He said, "You should have heard my teacher. He was amazing. I'm nothing. No good." But what better way to kind of celebrate what Godard was doing than making beauty in a fucking farmyard surrounded by death and murder.
Yeah. Actually, that shot, a forward reference. Do you remember when we reviewed that 7-minute Hungarian film called Wind, which was like a panning shot of 3 women standing in a farmyard
watching an execution take place.
There are 3 women who stand in a very similar way in that sequence of Weekend in the farmyard, and it was just really weird.
That makes me like Wind less. No, it doesn't.
Well, no, because I think Wind is based on a photo, right? Wind isn't really. I think it's just a coincidence, but it's just a thought I had.
Maybe. No, you're right. I think they probably are separate, but it's a remarkable coincidence, actually.
Yeah. Well, listeners can go on Mubi and if it's still on Mubi, I don't know.
They are. I mean, Godard. One thing we've learned from like him in the 60s is he's done more in 7 years than most filmmakers would do in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And he's travelled a lot of ground. And he's. How do you think he's, between 1960 and 1967? In what way are we looking at a different Godard, do you think?
I think he gets through and over a very important relationship with the star of many of his films that kind of plays out very publicly in these films in a very honest way. And I commend that. He also is, nascent political leanings become concretized into positions and analysis, which lays the ground, which culminates in Weekend, which is a very much a film with a class analysis, and that lays the groundwork for the more Marxist films that we'll review in the next episode about Godard. But I also think he just gets more money, and so is able to do more ambitious things. But they're all films where other films play roles, where there are direct references, in Van der Paar and Pierrot le Fou, or any time that there's crime, basically, there is like reference to the crime in cinema, in a very self-conscious way where films are mentioned, and that's almost maybe his most kind of like gauche quality in a way, like, but I kind of forgive it because it's true to the principle of what he's doing, and he's a film critic when he was a film critic, but I think that critic element is there throughout his work, especially when he uses collage and essay film later on. But I wanted to quote this quote from Le Mépris where I can't remember who says it to who, even though I just watched it 2 hours ago, but when it comes to making movies, dreams aren't enough. And it's this kind of realization by this playwright who's thinking about writing this film for Fritz Lang, and he's kind of full of these dreams and desires, but he realizes he's not committed to cinema as a form, and Godard, of course, is very committed to cinema as a form, so it's kind of nice to see that.
That's such a good summation in a way of him being, when I was chatting to you on like the other day about Godard as like the bricoleur, like the man who creates bricolage, who assembles, who creates collage, from Claude Lévi-Strauss's Anthropology. This is it's not enough to be the shaman. You have to be the engineer, you have to be the craftsman, you have to be the kind of almost the jack of all trades. And Godard does that. And it's one thing when he makes these, when he uses a piece of a piano concerto, or he uses a bit of classical art, or uses a bit of advertising copy, or a poster or something. He kind of makes them more beautiful. He makes Fritz Lang a vital filmmaker again. He gives Fritz Lang like a second life almost in Le Mépris. And it's incredible how he revitalizes things. He's like an electric shock, which I think is kind of what he was trying to do. Like, and all analysis aside, I think he was trying to like send a fucking cattle prod to the balls of French art, or global art. Actually, I wouldn't limit it to French art, to global art. And it's one thing I've always said is it's amazing that he's still alive. Like, When you watch these films, you watch like Breathless, and you go, the guy that made this is still around.
It's kind
kicking.
of futuristic.
It's kind
But
of
I mean,
weird.
I think on some level, I don't want to be
Do me.
no, not do me. Just I don't know. This is sort of somehow maybe silly, but like he clearly wants to still be alive. Like he does interviews. He talks about cinema. Like he's still writing scenarios and hopefully making more films. So yeah, like he's sharp as a tack. I mean, he's many people perfectly justified to retire, but it's always nice to see someone who keeps at it.
I watched film Socialisme.
Oh yeah,
I watched it at like 5 a.m.
Oh my god. Are you okay?
Yeah, no. I watched it about 5. I was up still, and I was like, I need to watch. I was either going to watch Mépris I was either going to watch Weekend or Film Socialisme, and I thought if I watch
was this
Weekend,
when you went out for drinks?
Yeah.
And you came back and watched Film Socialism at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
But it's just because it might have been my state of mind, but I was pretty hooked on it actually, which is, I was
that's
looking
great.
for
I'm looking
fall
forward to
asleep
seeing
to. It's weird. I don't want to say anymore. It's a really bizarre thing. So yeah, I don't want to say too much. I mean,
okay, cool.
yeah, but I
we'll
hope we've communicated our adoration for Godard in 1967, where we're leaving him right now. We're leaving him. He's still a young man. He's going bald slightly, kind of. He's got his suit. He's winking at us.
Got his sunglasses.
Yeah.
So that's that. I don't think I can. I can just feel my
How are you
body
feeling,
just
man?
giving out. Yeah. It's just during the
no.
pod, I've started to develop like mild, sort of. I don't know, just feeling a bit ill. But anyway, that's totally to be expected when you take a vaccine for COVID-19. Anyway, next week we'll be reviewing some early Almodovar with special guests. So looking forward to that. We're sort of alternating with the Godard, so we'll do that and then Godard 2, and then we'll
we don't want to overwhelm you with 3 Godards in a row, and it gives us a chance to ourselves. It gives us a chance to let these films percolate as well. Next week next episode, next part 2 of this will be Ziga Vertov group, and maybe
and we'll
Godard
creep into the 80s and 90s a little bit.
Oh yeah. So yeah, thanks for joining us on the ride. Prayers up for Ralph, who should go and have a big glass of water now.
I've got a small one here, but I do need a big one.
Have a big old glass of water, mate, and go have an early night.
Thank you.
Till 5
that was great.
Watching film sessions.
Thank you for listening, listeners. Stay safe. If you get the chance to get one of these fuckers in your arm, then you do it.
Heroin. He's talking about Le Nido. Yeah. He's chasing the dragon, ladies and gentlemen. Ralph has just been shooting up the whole fucking episode. Fucking Jim Morrison over here.
It is, yeah. I mean, yeah. That's how it is under lockdown. You got to.
Ralph is feeling breathless, you might say.
Maybe, but Vivre is V, and we're going to band together even though we're apart.
I do not have contempt for that view.
No, indeed. So enjoy the weekend, and we'll be next week. We'll be doing stuff. Yeah. All right.